In the rolling hills of Savannah, a 68-year-old retired teacher was about to uncover a disturbing family deception. What began as innocent offers of help from her son's new wife spiraled into a dangerous game of manipulation when medication mysteriously disappeared. Eleanor James wasn't the frail elderly woman they mistook her for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For 35 years, Eleanor had shaped young minds in Savannah's public schools, developing a keen eye for dishonesty and hidden motives. When her carefully organized pill containers began showing gaps where vital heart medication should be, she recognized the calculated pattern behind seemingly forgetful moments. "I may have arthritis in my hands, but there's nothing wrong with my mind," she would often say while grading papers long into retirement. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching cardinals flit through the magnolia tree that had graced her backyard since she and Robert first moved in 42 years ago. The morning light cast dappled shadows across her worn wooden countertops, illuminating the small blue pill organizer that now showed empty compartments where her heart medication should have been. She ran her finger across Wednesday's empty slot, certain she had filled it on Sunday evening as she had done every week since her mild heart attack 3 years ago. This wasn't the first time pills had gone missing, it was the third instance this month, and the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Curious, she murmured to herself, the habit of thinking aloud cultivated through decades of classroom discussions. Her son Michael had suggested she was simply forgetting to take her medication or misplacing pills. Her daughter-in-law Diane had nodded sympathetically, offering to help manage things with increasing frequency. Eleanor sipped her morning tea, Earl Grey with a splash of milk, the same way Robert had prepared it every morning during their 40-year marriage before cancer took him 5 years ago. The familiar taste brought comfort as she contemplated the unsettling situation developing around her. Her fingertips traced the familiar edge of the silver-framed photograph on the counter, her and Robert on their 40th anniversary, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. "What would you do, Robert?" she whispered to the smiling face that had been her anchor through life's storms. The answer came as clearly as if he'd spoken aloud, "Trust your instincts, Ellie. You've always known when something wasn't right." And her instincts were screaming that something was very wrong indeed. Eleanor had first noticed the discrepancies 3 months after Michael and Diane moved to Savannah. After 20 years in Atlanta's corporate world, Michael had accepted a position at Savannah College of Art and Design's administration, bringing his new wife of just 8 months to the historic coastal city. The timing had seemed perfect, Eleanor approaching her 7th decade alone, Michael wanting to be closer, and Diane eager to help care for dear Eleanor. But help had quickly transformed into something that felt increasingly like control. "Mom, you're getting more forgetful," Michael had commented last week when she couldn't recall the name of a restaurant they'd visited. "It happens with age." "It's perfectly normal," Diane had added, patting Eleanor's hand with the practiced sympathy of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. "My grandmother was the same way before we had to move her to assisted living." The phrase, "had to move her," had lingered in Eleanor's mind like a warning bell. There was nothing wrong with assisted living facilities, she had friends who lived happily in several around Savannah. But the choice should be made from necessity and personal decision, not because someone else decided it was time. Eleanor carefully took her pills from the backup bottle she had hidden inside an old teapot in the back of her pantry, a precaution she'd taken after the second time her medication had disappeared. The cardiologist had been clear, missing doses of her heart medication could be dangerous, potentially fatal. Whoever was removing her pills wasn't just interfering with her independence, they were playing with her life. The doorbell's cheerful chime interrupted her thoughts. Through the leaded glass panels, she could see her granddaughter Sophie's distinctive purple-streaked hair. At 24, Sophie was the bright spot in Eleanor's life, sharp-minded, compassionate, and fiercely protective of her grandmother. "Grammy E." Sophie called as she burst through the door, bringing the energy of youth and the scent of lavender essential oil that she always wore. Her art school education and free spirit made her different from her father's corporate precision, a contrast Eleanor had always cherished. Sophie's smile faded as she noticed the pill organizer and the serious expression on her grandmother's face. "What's wrong? You look like you're plotting a revolution." "Perhaps I am," Eleanor replied, gesturing to the empty compartments in her pill case. "This is the 3rd time this month my heart medication has disappeared." Sophie's artistic expression immediately shifted to one of alarm. "Missing? How? You're meticulously organized." "That's precisely my point. I don't misplace these pills. Someone is removing them." Sophie dropped her portfolio case on the counter and sat beside Eleanor at the kitchen table where generations of the James family had shared meals, homework, and life decisions. "Who would do that? And why?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor hesitated. Accusing family members of something so serious wasn't done lightly, especially when it involved her only son. I'm not certain, but the timing corresponds with your father and Diane's visits. Sophie's expression darkened. She had never quite warmed to her new stepmother, though she maintained polite relations for her father's sake. Diane? But why would she? Sophie stopped mid-sentence, her artist's imagination quickly connecting dots. The house. The house. Eleanor's Victorian home in Savannah's historic district had been in Robert's family for 3 generations. With property values soaring as the city became an increasingly popular tourist destination, the old house on Whitaker Street was worth well over $1 million. Eleanor had mentioned to Michael just 2 months ago that she was considering adding Sophie's name to the deed, to ensure the house stayed in the family if anything happened to her. Diane had been visibly upset by the news. I think it's time we gather some evidence, Sophie said, pulling out her phone. If someone is messing with your medication, we need to know for sure. By that afternoon, Sophie had installed a small security camera disguised as a decorative clock on Eleanor's kitchen shelf, positioned with a clear view of the pill organizer on the counter. She had also helped Eleanor set up a hidden compartment in the old roll-top desk where she could store a duplicate set of her medications. I feel like we're in a spy movie, Eleanor commented as Sophie showed her how to access the camera feed on her iPad. Sometimes life requires a little espionage, Grammy, Sophie replied. Especially when people underestimate you because of your age. That evening, as Eleanor prepared for her weekly dinner with Michael and Diane, she felt a strange combination of dread and determination. For 35 years, she had taught her students to stand up for themselves, to question authority, and to fight injustice. Now, she needed to apply those same lessons to her own life. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway struck 6, its deep resonant chimes echoing through the house just as Michael's key turned in the front door lock. He had never returned his key after Robert's death, a fact that had seemed comforting. Until recently. Mom, we brought your favorite dessert, Michael called, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness Eleanor had begun to recognize as his way of speaking to someone he considered fragile. Diane followed, perfectly coiffed in designer clothes that seemed excessive for a family dinner, carrying a bakery box with the logo of Eleanor's favorite patisserie. Lemon squares, she announced, setting them on the counter uncomfortably close to the pill organizer. Since you mentioned you were craving them last week. Eleanor couldn't recall mentioning lemon squares, but she smiled and thanked them anyway. Years of parent-teacher conferences had taught her to maintain a pleasant demeanor even when she suspected she was being manipulated. Dinner progressed with the usual small talk, Michael's work at the college, Diane's latest volunteer committee, neighborhood gossip about the Andersons' renovation disaster. Eleanor participated while observing Diane's eyes repeatedly drifting to the pill organizer on the counter, a subtle calculation in her gaze that most people would miss. How are you feeling, Eleanor? Diane asked as they moved to the living room for coffee. You seemed a bit unsteady earlier when you were serving dinner. Did I? Eleanor replied, though she had felt perfectly steady. I'm fine, just a touch of arthritis in my knee acting up. Dad and I have been talking, Diane continued, settling onto the sofa beside Michael with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. We're concerned about you living alone in this big house. All these stairs, so much maintenance, and what if you fell? What if you needed help in the middle of the night? And it's a pattern many adult children fall into without recognizing it. Your willingness to see that tendency in yourself makes you uniquely qualified to help others avoid the same pitfall. I'd like to be more involved in the coalition, Michael said, his decision seemingly forming as he spoke. Particularly in working with adult children who genuinely want to support their parents without overstepping boundaries. Eleanor felt a wave of pride in her son's resilience. He had emerged from the betrayal and dissolution of his marriage not embittered, but with deeper wisdom and commitment to making amends in meaningful ways. The coalition would be fortunate to have you, she said simply. 2 weeks after the forum, Eleanor sat at her dining room table surrounded by stacks of letters from seniors and family members across the state. The local newspaper coverage of her presentation had been picked up by regional outlets, and her story had struck a chord with readers far beyond Savannah. Sophie entered with a tray of tea and slices of freshly baked banana bread, surveying the organized chaos with amusement. Your correspondence has officially exceeded your capacity to handle it alone, Grammy. I think we need to consider some help. Eleanor smiled ruefully. I never imagined so many people would reach out. Each letter deserves a thoughtful response, but you're right, I can't manage this volume alone. Which is why I've brought reinforcements, Sophie announced as the doorbell rang. The cavalry has arrived. Eleanor watched in surprise as 6 of her former teaching colleagues filed into her dining room, led by Margaret Chen with her characteristic efficiency. "We've come to establish command headquarters," Margaret announced briskly. "Harold is handling database creation, Beatrice will coordinate local resources for referrals, and the rest of us will help with correspondence." "You can't possibly want to spend your retirement answering other people's letters," Eleanor protested weakly, though she was deeply moved by their offer. Beatrice Johnson snorted delicately. "Eleanor James, we spent decades shaping young minds together. Did you honestly think we'd let you take on this vital work alone? Besides, my garden is dormant for the winter, and my bridge club is becoming tedious. This is far more interesting." Within hours, Eleanor's dining room had transformed into an efficient operations center for what her friends were already calling the Eleanor James Initiative. They categorized inquiries, developed response templates for common concerns, compiled resource lists for different regions, and created a scheduling system for follow-up contact with particularly vulnerable individuals. As evening approached, Eleanor stood in the doorway watching this impromptu team work with the same dedication they had once brought to their classrooms. The sight filled her with a profound sense of purpose and community that transcended her individual experience. "You've started something remarkable," Sophie observed quietly, joining her grandmother. "Something that's going to help so many people." "We've started something," Eleanor corrected gently. "None of this would exist without your help with the security camera, or Michael's willingness to confront painful truths, or the legal and medical expertise of Barbara and Dr. Patel. This is a community creation." 3 days later, Eleanor received an unexpected call from the State Attorney General's office. The Assistant AG introduced herself and came directly to the point. "Mrs. James, we've been following your advocacy work with considerable interest. Our office is establishing a task force on elder exploitation, and we'd like you to serve as a civilian consultant." The invitation marked a significant expansion of Eleanor's influence. Working with state prosecutors, law enforcement, and social service agencies, she helped develop training programs to recognize exploitation attempts and protocols for intervention that respected seniors' autonomy while providing necessary protection. By early spring, what had begun as one woman's self-defense strategy had evolved into a comprehensive statewide initiative. The Eleanor James Protocol was being implemented in hospitals, senior centers, and law enforcement agencies throughout Georgia, with other states beginning to request information about adapting it for their own communities. On a particularly beautiful April morning, Eleanor walked through her garden, admiring the azaleas that had burst into vibrant bloom overnight. Robert had planted these bushes decades ago, envisioning the mature garden they would eventually create. Eleanor often thought about how he would view the unexpected direction her life had taken, the betrayal that might have destroyed her independence becoming instead the catalyst for her most significant contribution. The sound of Sophie's car in the driveway interrupted her reflections. Her granddaughter emerged with an excited expression that suggested important news. "Grammy, wait until you hear this," Sophie called, hurrying across the lawn. "The National Council on Aging wants to feature your story and the protection protocol in their keynote address at the annual conference in Washington. They're asking if you'd be willing to speak." Eleanor absorbed this news with a mixture of surprise and thoughtful consideration. A national platform would significantly amplify the reach of her advocacy work, potentially helping vulnerable seniors across the country. Yet it would also mean revisiting painful aspects of her personal experience in a very public forum. "This isn't just about my story anymore," she said finally. "It's about creating systemic change in how we approach elder autonomy and protection. If sharing what happened helps achieve that, then I should do it." Sophie studied her grandmother with evident pride. "You know, most people would have just focused on putting their own lives back together after what you experienced. Instead, you've created something that's helping thousands of others." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the classroom philosophy that had guided her teaching career. "I always told my students that the measure of education isn't just what you know, but what you do with that knowledge. The same applies to experience. It's not just what happens to you, but what you create from it that matters." As they walked back toward the house, Michael's car pulled up beside Sophie's. He emerged carrying several file folders and a laptop, tools for the coalition work that had increasingly become his focus in recent months. "Perfect timing," he called. "I've just come from a meeting with the mayor's office. They've approved funding for our community education program. We can start training sessions next month." Eleanor felt a surge of satisfaction watching her son's enthusiasm for this work. His partnership in the coalition had accelerated his healing process, transforming guilt into constructive action that honored both his mother's experience and his own need for redemption. That evening, the 3 generations of the James family sat on Eleanor's porch, planning the next phase of their advocacy work while enjoying the fragrant spring air. The conversation flowed easily between practical logistics and deeper reflections on the nature of family, trust, and resilience. "I've been thinking about something," Michael said during a momentary lull. "When all this started with Diane, it seemed like the worst crisis our family had ever faced. But now, looking at what's grown from it." He gestured toward the dining room where maps tracked the expansion of the protection protocol across the state. "It's become one of the most meaningful chapters of our lives." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "There's a concept in Japanese art called kintsugi, repairing broken pottery with gold, creating something more beautiful and valuable than the original piece. The damage isn't hidden, it's highlighted and transformed. That's what we've done with this experience." Speaking of transformation, Sophie added, "I have some news I haven't shared yet. Remember that grant application I submitted to the Arts Council? They've approved funding for a series of educational murals about elder autonomy and protection. Art as advocacy, combining both my passions." Eleanor's eyes brightened at this news. "Where will these murals be located?" "Senior centers throughout the coastal region, with the first one here in Savannah," Sophie explained. "Each will incorporate stories from local seniors who've faced exploitation attempts, translated into visual metaphors that communicate the warning signs and empowerment strategies." As evening deepened into night, Eleanor sat between her son and granddaughter, contemplating the unexpected journey that had brought them here. The path had been painful, marked by betrayal and difficult revelations, yet it had led to this moment of shared purpose and deeper connection. Later, after Michael and Sophie had departed, Eleanor stood once more in her garden, looking up at the stars that had witnessed generations of her family's joys and sorrows. The same house that Diane had coveted had become headquarters for a movement that was changing how communities protected their most vulnerable members while honoring their wisdom and autonomy. Eleanor thought of the hundreds of letters she had received from seniors who had recognized their own situations in her story and found the courage to seek help. She thought of the adult children who had written about reconsidering their approach to aging parents, seeking partnership rather than control. She thought of law enforcement officers and healthcare providers now better equipped to recognize and address exploitation attempts. Michael nodded, his expression a mixture of concern and what Eleanor recognized as guilt. "Mom, we're thinking maybe it's time to consider downsizing, or perhaps looking at one of those nice retirement communities like Magnolia Gardens." Eleanor took a slow sip of her coffee, buying time to control her response. Magnolia Gardens was indeed a lovely facility, for people who needed constant supervision and care. Eleanor, who still drove herself to weekly book club meetings, volunteered at the library twice a week, and maintained her garden with minimal help, was nowhere near requiring that level of assistance. "That's thoughtful of you both to be concerned," she said carefully. "But I'm managing quite well here. This home holds 42 years of memories with your father. I'm not ready to leave it." "But Mom, your health," Michael began, "is being monitored by Dr. Patel, who says I'm doing remarkably well for someone my age," Eleanor finished firmly. "In fact, I have an appointment with her next week for my regular checkup." "I could drive you," Diane offered quickly. "In fact, I could come in with you. Sometimes patients don't remember everything the doctor says." The implication that Eleanor couldn't reliably report her own medical information hung in the air like a challenge. She met Diane's gaze steadily. "Thank you, but Sophie has already arranged to take me. She enjoys our lunch dates afterward." A flicker of annoyance crossed Diane's perfectly made-up face before she composed herself. "Sophie is so busy with her art career. I wouldn't want to impose on her time." "My granddaughter never considers time with me an imposition," Eleanor replied, her teacher's voice emerging slightly, the tone that had silenced unruly teenagers for decades. After they left, Eleanor sat in Robert's old armchair, thinking through the evening's conversation. The pattern was becoming clearer, questioning her memory, suggesting she was physically unstable, trying to isolate her from Sophie, and now directly proposing she leave her home. Combined with the missing medication, it painted a disturbing picture. Eleanor picked up her phone and called her old friend Margaret Chen, who had practiced family law in Savannah for 40 years before her recent retirement. "Maggie, I need your advice," Eleanor said when her friend answered. "And I need absolute discretion." The next morning, Eleanor visited the Chatham County Recorder of Deeds office with paperwork Margaret had helped her prepare the night before. The clerk, a former student of Eleanor's, processed the documents with a mixture of efficiency and concern. "Ms. James, are you sure about this change to your property deed? It's a significant legal step." "I'm very sure, Tanya," Eleanor replied. "Recent events have made me realize the importance of having my affairs in proper order." That afternoon, Eleanor moved her most important documents, her will, insurance policies, medical directives, And the original copy of her property deed, from the roll-top desk in her study to a safe deposit box at Coastal Heritage Bank. The only person besides herself with access was Sophie. Eleanor also made appointments with her cardiologist and her primary care physician for the following week. Margaret had emphasized the importance of having recent medical evaluations that clearly documented her mental competence and her ability to manage her own healthcare and financial decisions. Document everything, Margaret had advised. If someone is trying to build a case that you're incompetent, you need to build a stronger case proving otherwise. For the next 3 days, Eleanor maintained her normal routine while waiting for the security camera to capture evidence. She taught her Tuesday literature class at the senior center, met with her garden club on Wednesday, and on Thursday, she received the call from Sophie that changed everything. "Grammy, you need to see this." Sophie's voice was tense with controlled anger. "I checked the camera feed from yesterday when I knew Dad and Diane were visiting you for lunch." That evening, Sophie showed Eleanor the footage captured while she had stepped into the garden to cut fresh herbs for their meal. The video clearly showed Diane approaching the pill organizer, quickly opening several compartments, and pocketing multiple pills while glancing toward the back door to ensure Eleanor was still outside. "I can't believe it," Eleanor whispered, though part of her had known exactly what they would find. "She's deliberately taking my heart medication." Sophie's hands were trembling with rage. "This isn't just manipulation, Grammy. This is potentially attempted murder. Missing those pills could cause you to have another heart attack." "But why?" Eleanor asked, though she already suspected the answer. "What does she gain by making me sick?" "Control," Sophie replied grimly. "If you become ill enough, Dad would have grounds to take over your finances and healthcare decisions. And given how he listens to her, that means Diane would effectively control everything, including this house." Eleanor sat back in her chair, the weight of this betrayal settling over her. Michael, her only child, had brought into her life someone who was willing to risk her health, possibly her life, for financial gain. "What do we do now?" Sophie asked. "Should we go to the police?" Eleanor considered the question carefully. Police involvement would mean public accusations against her son's wife, potential criminal charges, and a family fracture that might never heal. But doing nothing meant remaining vulnerable to increasingly dangerous manipulation. "First, we secure my safety," Eleanor decided. "Tomorrow, I'm changing the locks on all the doors. Then we gather more evidence. And then, we confront them, but on my terms, not theirs." Sophie squeezed her grandmother's hand. "I'm so sorry this is happening." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, the posture that generations of students had recognized as her taking charge stance. "Don't be sorry. Be strategic. They think I'm a forgetful old woman who can be easily manipulated and controlled. They're about to discover how wrong they are." That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor looked at the photographs on her nightstand. Robert in his Navy uniform before they were married, Michael's college graduation, Sophie's first art show. Family had always been the center of her life, the foundation of her identity. The thought that her own son might be complicit in something so underhanded filled her with a sadness that threatened to overwhelm her determination. But as she turned out the light, she remembered Robert's favorite quote from their college days: "The ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in moments of comfort, but where they stand in times of challenge and controversy." Eleanor James had faced challenges before: Robert's cancer, the difficulties of raising a son alone after his death, rebuilding her life as a widow. This new battle was different, but she would face it with the same courage and integrity she had taught her students to value above all else. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations and painful realizations. But tonight, Eleanor fell asleep with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime standing up for what was right. And who wasn't about to stop now, especially when her very life depended on it. "Remember," she whispered to herself as sleep approached, "they may be younger, but you've been outsmarting people for decades longer than they've been alive." The next morning, Eleanor awoke with purpose flowing through her veins. The security camera footage had confirmed what her instincts had been screaming: someone she had welcomed into her family was actively working to undermine her health and independence. Rather than fear, she felt a surprising clarity, the same mental sharpness that had helped her manage classrooms of 30 teenagers for decades. "Knowledge is power," she murmured to herself, a phrase she had repeated to generations of students. Now she needed to apply that principle to protect herself. By 9 o'clock, a locksmith was changing every lock in the historic Victorian home. By 10, Eleanor had called her bank and placed alerts on all her accounts, requiring in-person verification for any significant withdrawals or changes. By 11, she had an appointment with Dr. Patel, her cardiologist, scheduled for the following day. "Ms. Eleanor, all done," said Mr. Ramirez, the locksmith who had served Savannah's historic district for 20 years. New deadbolts on all exterior doors, just like you asked. Thank you, Carlos, Eleanor replied, accepting the new keys. And you're certain these can't be copied at a regular hardware store? No, ma'am. These are restricted keyways, they can only be duplicated with your signed authorization form and ID. As the locksmith departed, Sophie arrived with lunch and an update. I spoke to my friend Ben at the police department, she said, setting out containers of soup and sandwiches from their favorite local cafe. He explained our options if we want to file a report about the medication tampering. Eleanor listened carefully as she arranged their lunch on the sun porch, where spring light filtered through century-old windows. What did he recommend? He says we have enough evidence for a police report, but prosecuting would be challenging without proving intent. Sophie's face reflected her frustration. The camera shows her taking the pills, but not what she did with them or why. So we need more, Eleanor said thoughtfully. More evidence, more documentation. Ben also suggested we consult an elder law attorney. Sophie dipped her spoon into the tomato bisque. He said medication tampering often accompanies other forms of elder exploitation. Eleanor nodded. Diane, through her attorney, had indeed attempted to question Eleanor's competence. Filing motions suggesting her age and supposed cognitive decline made her an unreliable witness. Dr. Patel's detailed medical reports and the mini-mental status examination she had administered immediately after discovering the medication tampering effectively countered these claims. The video evidence proved even more difficult for the defense to overcome, though Abernathy attempted to suggest alternative explanations for Diane's actions. Through it all, Eleanor maintained her composure, approaching each legal hurdle with the same methodical determination that had characterized her teaching career. She prepared for each meeting as thoroughly as she had once prepared lessons, reviewed legal documents with the same attention she had given to student essays, and never allowed frustration to override her strategic thinking. 6 weeks after the initial confrontation, Eleanor sat in Barbara Washington's office reviewing the latest development in the case. The elegant elder law attorney looked particularly satisfied as she explained the situation. The prosecutor called this morning. Diane is considering a plea agreement. Eleanor set down her teacup carefully. What kind of agreement? She would plead guilty to a reduced charge of attempted exploitation of an elder, complete community service, undergo counseling, and maintain the restraining order. In exchange, they would drop the more serious charges related to the medication tampering. Michael, who had accompanied Eleanor to the meeting, leaned forward. That seems lenient given what she did. Barbara nodded understanding. It may seem that way, but successful prosecutions in elder exploitation cases are notoriously difficult. Juries often struggle with family dynamics and intentionality. The plea ensures consequences while avoiding the stress of a trial. Eleanor considered this carefully. The prospect of testifying in open court, of having her family's painful situation exposed to public scrutiny, had been weighing on her. Yet she also believed in accountability. What's your recommendation, Barbara? The attorney considered the question with professional thoroughness. The plea accomplishes several important goals. It creates an official record of Diane's actions, which would be accessible should she attempt similar behavior with someone else in the future. It maintains the protective order keeping her away from you. And it allows your family to begin healing without the prolonged stress of trial proceedings. And the medication tampering? Eleanor asked. That seems like the most serious offense to me. It is, Barbara agreed. But proving intent, that she took the medication specifically to cause you harm rather than for some other purpose, creates evidentiary challenges. The exploitation charge actually carries similar penalties while being easier to prove conclusively. After discussing the options further, Eleanor made her decision. I'll accept the plea agreement, provided the restraining order becomes permanent. And the exploitation charge remains on her record. As they left the attorney's office, Michael seemed troubled. Mom, are you sure about this? Part of me wants to see her face full consequences for what she did to you. Eleanor paused on the sidewalk, looking at her son with compassionate understanding. Michael, the hardest lesson I've learned through all this isn't about Diane, it's about the difference between justice and vengeance. Justice requires accountability and protection from future harm. Vengeance seeks suffering as retribution. And you're satisfied with justice without vengeance? He asked. I am, she replied simply. Pursuing vengeance would keep us trapped in this painful chapter. Justice allows us to close it and write something new. That evening, as Eleanor tended her garden in the golden light of approaching sunset, Sophie arrived with unexpected news. Grammy, you won't believe what I just heard, she said, settling onto the garden bench beside her grandmother. Remember Mrs. Levinson from your book club? Eleanor nodded, adjusting her gardening gloves. Of course. Her daughter moved her to that assisted living facility last year. We exchange letters occasionally. Well, apparently her daughter Patricia started dating someone new a few months ago. A pharmaceutical sales representative named Diane. Eleanor's hand stilled. On the rosebush she had been pruning. Diane? Surely not. The same Diane, Sophie confirmed grimly. And according to Mrs. Levinson's nurse, whom I know from volunteer work, Patricia has suddenly become very interested in her mother's finances and property. Eleanor sat back, absorbing this troubling information. Has anyone warned them? That's why I came straight here. I wasn't sure what we could legally say given the ongoing case. Eleanor removed her gardening gloves deliberately, her decision already forming. Call Barbara Washington. We need to know what we can disclose. And to whom? If Diane is establishing a pattern of targeting elderly people through their adult children, that information needs to reach the proper authorities. The discovery that Mrs. Levinson might be Diane's next target added urgency to Eleanor's decision to accept the plea agreement. Working with Barbara Washington and the district attorney's office, they arranged for Mrs. Levinson's situation to be investigated by Adult Protective Services while the criminal case against Diane proceeded. 2 days later, Eleanor received a call from Jeremy Matthews at the DA's office. Mrs. James, I thought you should know immediately. Diane has accepted the plea agreement, with all your conditions. She'll be formally entering her guilty plea tomorrow morning. Thank you for letting me know, Eleanor replied, a sense of closure beginning to settle over her. Will I need to be present? Not for this proceeding. But I wanted to tell you something else. After we presented evidence that she might be targeting another elderly woman, she became much more willing to accept the plea. I think she realized we were establishing a pattern of behavior that would be very difficult to defend against. After ending the call, Eleanor walked through her historic home, touching familiar objects that connected her to generations of family history. The roll-top desk where Robert had written letters to her during his Navy service. The dining room table where they had celebrated Christmas dinners and Michael's academic achievements. The reading nook where she had taught Sophie to love literature. This house had nearly become the centerpiece of a predatory scheme. Instead, it remained a sanctuary of memory and possibility, protected by her own foresight and courage. Michael found her there, gazing out at the garden where spring flowers were reaching their full bloom. Mom? Is everything all right? Everything is as it should be, she replied thoughtfully. Diane has accepted the plea agreement. It's finally ending. Relief washed across his face. That's wonderful news. There's something else we should discuss, Eleanor said, turning to face him fully. It's time for you to find your own place again. Surprise registered in his expression. Are you sure? I don't mind staying longer if you'd feel safer. Eleanor smiled gently. This was never about my safety, Michael. It was about my autonomy, my right to make my own choices about my life and home. Having you here was necessary during the crisis, but now it's important that we both reclaim our independence. Understanding dawned in his eyes. You're right. I've been using taking care of you as a way to avoid rebuilding my own life. We all need safety nets in times of crisis, Eleanor said. But we also need the courage to step beyond them when the crisis passes. Later that evening, as a spring shower brought fresh sense of renewal through the open windows, Eleanor sat at her desk writing in her journal. She had maintained this record faithfully throughout the ordeal with Diane, documenting not just events but her reflections on them, creating meaning from difficulty in the way she had always taught her students to do. Today she wrote, "The most dangerous predators are those who convince us that we need their protection from threats that don't exist, or that they themselves have created." Diane nearly succeeded by manufacturing evidence of my decline, then positioning herself as the solution to problems she was causing. The experience has reminded me that wisdom isn't just about what we know, but about having the courage to act on that knowledge. I knew something was wrong with my medication. I knew Diane's concern wasn't genuine. Acting on those insights rather than dismissing them as paranoia saved not only my independence but possibly my life. Michael is healing, though the scars of betrayal will take time to fade completely. Sophie has discovered a passion for elder advocacy that may shape her future career. And I have rediscovered strengths I had forgotten I possessed. Tomorrow, Diane will formally admit her guilt, and one chapter of this difficult story will close. But the larger story continues: how we protect the vulnerable without diminishing their autonomy, how we support one another without controlling one another, how we rebuild trust after betrayal. These are lessons worth learning at any age. Eleanor closed her journal and moved to the window, watching raindrops create temporary jewels on the magnolia leaves. The storm would pass, as all storms eventually do, leaving nourishment for new growth. She had weathered this one with the same resilience that had carried her through life's previous challenges, emerging not just intact but somehow more fully herself, more certain of her strength. More clear about her boundaries, more determined to protect not just herself but others who might face similar threats. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Eleanor James stood at her window, a guardian of her own destiny, watching the rain renew her garden with the peaceful certainty that she had done what needed to be done, hiding the deed, protecting her future, and in the process, rediscovering the teacher, advocate, and protector she had always been. The Savannah Senior Citizens Protection Coalition had never seen attendance like this. The community center auditorium was filled to capacity, with additional chairs hastily arranged along the walls to accommodate the overflow crowd. Reporters from local news stations set up cameras at the back, while representatives from senior centers across 3 counties clustered near the front. Eleanor James smoothed her navy blue blazer as she reviewed her notes at the podium, still somewhat amazed that her personal ordeal had transformed into this moment of public advocacy. 6 months had passed since Diane had entered her guilty plea, 6 months of healing, rebuilding, and ultimately, purpose. 5 minutes, Mrs. James, the event coordinator whispered, adjusting the microphone. The mayor has just arrived. Eleanor nodded her thanks, scanning the audience. In the front row sat Sophie, beaming with pride, alongside Michael, whose initial reluctance about this public forum had gradually transformed into support. Dr. Patel was there too, along with Barbara Washington, Jeremy Matthews from the DA's office, and a dozen of Eleanor's former teaching colleagues who had become her informal advocacy team. Most moving were the faces she didn't recognize, elderly citizens from throughout the region, many accompanied by adult children or caregivers, all drawn by the story of a retired teacher who had protected herself from exploitation and was now working to protect others. At precisely 10 o'clock, the president of the coalition approached the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this important forum on elder safety and autonomy. What began as one woman's personal battle has evolved into a community-wide initiative that is already changing how we approach elder protection. It is my honor to introduce Eleanor James, whose courage and foresight have inspired this coalition. The applause that greeted Eleanor as she took the podium carried a warmth that steadied her nerves. Public speaking had been her profession for decades, but addressing an audience about such personal matters required a different kind of courage. Good morning, she began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. 6 months ago, I discovered that my daughter-in-law was removing my heart medication from my pill organizer, creating a dangerous situation that could have led to a cardiac event. Her goal was to make me appear incompetent so she could gain control of my home and assets. Eleanor paused, looking directly at the audience. I'm not sharing this story to gain sympathy or to sensationalize a painful family situation. I'm sharing it because what happened to me is happening to seniors throughout our community, often with devastating consequences. The difference in my case was that I recognized the warning signs and took action before it was too late. Over the next 30 minutes, Eleanor outlined what she called the protection protocol, the systematic approach to elder safety that she had developed with Barbara Washington and a team of healthcare professionals. She explained the importance of documenting suspicious incidents, securing important legal documents, creating multiple layers of security for medications and finances, and building a network of trusted allies who could provide objective verification of an elder's capabilities. The most insidious aspect of elder exploitation, Eleanor explained, is how it uses our natural aging process against us. When we occasionally forget a name or misplace an item, as people of any age might do, these normal moments become evidence of incompetence. The exploiter gradually convinces others that we can no longer trust our own perceptions or manage our own affairs. She held up the small security camera that had captured Diane's actions. Technology like this is increasingly accessible, even to those of us who didn't grow up in the digital age. I never imagined at 68 that I would be installing security cameras or creating digital documentation systems, but I discovered that these tools were well within my capabilities. As Eleanor moved into the question and answer portion of the presentation, a woman in her 70s raised her hand. Mrs. James, what would you say to those of us who worry about seeming paranoid or ungrateful if we question our children's motives? Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. I would say that genuine care respects autonomy. Anyone who truly has your best interests at heart will support your right to maintain control over your own life and decisions. They'll welcome transparency and verification rather than being offended by them. A middle-aged man stood next. My mother lives alone, and I worry about her safety. How do I show genuine concern without making her feel that I'm trying to control her? That's an excellent question, Eleanor replied. The key is partnership rather than management. Offer support for specific challenges rather than global solutions that diminish independence. For instance, instead of suggesting your mother can no longer live alone because she struggles with home maintenance, arrange specific assistance for those tasks while respecting her authority over her household. The questions continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from legal protections to family communication strategies to community resources. Throughout, Eleanor maintained the same calm authority that had characterized her classroom teaching, acknowledging the complexity of the issues while offering practical, accessible solutions. As the formal program concluded, people lined up to speak with Eleanor personally, many sharing their own experiences with exploitation attempts or family conflicts over independence. She listened to each one with genuine attention, offering encouragement, suggestions, or simply the validation that came from being truly heard. Among those waiting was an elegant woman in her 80s whom Eleanor didn't recognize. When her turn came, she clasped Eleanor's hands warmly. "Mrs. James, I'm Elizabeth Levinson. My nurse showed me the information about your daughter-in-law. After your granddaughter contacted Adult Protective Services, I believe you saved me from a similar fate." Eleanor's breath caught. This was the woman Diane had been targeting through her daughter Patricia. "Mrs. Levinson, I'm so glad you're here. How are you doing now?" "Much better since I recognized what was happening," Elizabeth replied. "Patricia was quite upset when I revoked her power of attorney and appointed my nephew instead, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. The authorities found several of my personal items in Diane's possession, items Patricia had reported as missing, to suggest I was becoming forgetful." Eleanor shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry about your daughter's involvement, but relieved you discovered the truth in time. That's why I wanted to thank you personally," Elizabeth continued. "Your willingness to speak out created a ripple effect that reached me before serious harm could occur. And now I've joined your coalition to help spread the word to others." After the last attendee had departed, Eleanor gathered with her closest supporters in the community center's small conference room. Barbara Washington handed her a glass of sparkling water with a triumphant smile. "That was remarkable, Eleanor. The mayor has already asked about implementing your protection protocol as an official city initiative for senior services. The medical community is on board as well," Dr. Patel added. "I've spoken with the hospital board about incorporating your documentation guidelines into our standard practices for geriatric patients." Eleanor accepted their congratulations with genuine gratitude, but her attention was drawn to Michael, who had been unusually quiet throughout the day. "What did you think?" she asked gently when they had a moment alone. He met her eyes with a complexity of emotion that reflected their journey over these past months. "I think you've transformed something painful into something powerful. But I'm still struggling with my role in what happened." Eleanor had anticipated this. The healing between them had been gradual, with moments of progress interspersed with painful reckonings as Michael confronted his own blindness to Diane's manipulation. "Come walk with me," she suggested, leading him out to the community center's garden where late autumn flowers still bloomed against the cooling temperatures. As they walked the winding paths, Eleanor chose her words carefully. "When I was teaching American literature, we often discussed how the protagonist's greatest weakness often becomes their greatest strength through the crucible of challenge. Your compassion and willingness to see the best in others made you vulnerable to Diane's manipulation, but those same qualities make you an extraordinary ally in this new work." Michael considered this thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about something you said during your talk, about partnership versus management in supporting elderly family members. I realized I had begun to manage you rather than partner with you, even before Diane's influence." "That's a powerful insight," Eleanor acknowledged. "One day at a time," she murmured to herself, the mantra that had carried her through Robert's illness, through the challenges of single parenthood, and now through this unexpected battle in what should have been her peaceful retirement years. The house felt different now. Michael had moved into the guest room temporarily while he sorted through the wreckage of his brief marriage. His presence was both comforting and complicated, bringing family closeness while also serving as a constant reminder of how thoroughly they had all been deceived. Downstairs, she could hear him moving about the kitchen, the familiar sounds of coffee brewing and dishes being arranged. Despite everything, he had maintained his father's habit of preparing breakfast for her each morning, a small gesture of atonement and care that spoke volumes. Eleanor finished her morning preparations and made her way downstairs, where the aroma of fresh coffee and blueberry muffins greeted her. Michael looked up from the newspaper spread before him, his expression brightening at her appearance. "Good morning, Mom. I made your favorite." "I can smell them," she replied with a smile, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. "Any news this morning?" Michael's expression tightened slightly. "Barbara Washington called while you were getting ready. The district attorney has decided to proceed with criminal charges against Diane. They want you to come in this afternoon to review your statement." Eleanor nodded, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. The decision to pursue criminal charges hadn't been easy, but Dr. Patel's documentation of the potential life-threatening consequences of medication tampering had made it clear this wasn't merely a family dispute. "Sophie will be here at 1. To drive me," she said, spreading a small amount of butter on a warm muffin. "Will you be joining us?" Michael hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. "I've given my statement already. And I have a meeting with the divorce attorney at 2. He looked down at his coffee. "Part of me still can't believe this is happening. 8 months ago, I thought I was beginning a new chapter of happiness. Now I'm filing police reports against my wife and dissolving our marriage." Eleanor reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "Life rarely follows the paths we expect, Michael. The question isn't whether we face disappointment, it's what we build from those broken expectations." He managed a small smile. "You sound like you're back in your classroom." "Once a teacher, always a teacher," she replied. "Some lessons I had to learn myself before I could pass them on to others." Their conversation was interrupted by the doorbell. Michael tensed immediately, a new habit since Diane's threatening departure. Despite the temporary restraining order, they remained vigilant about unexpected visitors. "I'll get it," he said, moving quickly to the front door. Eleanor heard murmured conversation, then Michael returned with a small, professionally dressed woman she didn't recognize. "Mom, this is Lisa Hernandez from the District Attorney's Victims Services Unit. She wanted to speak with you before this afternoon's meeting." Lisa stepped forward with a warm, professional smile. "Mrs. James, I apologize for coming without an appointment, but we had an opening in the schedule and I thought it might be helpful to prepare you for what to expect today." Eleanor welcomed the young woman into her home, offering coffee which Lisa gratefully accepted. They settled in the living room, where Lisa explained the legal process that was unfolding around Diane's actions. "The medication tampering alone constitutes a serious felony," Lisa explained. "Combined with the financial exploitation attempt and the direct threat she made, the DA believes we have a strong case." "What should my mother expect today?" Michael asked, his protective instincts evident. "Primarily, we'll review her statement for accuracy and completeness. The defense attorney will eventually receive these statements, so we need to ensure everything is precisely documented." Lisa turned to Eleanor. "You should also know that cases involving elder exploitation can become contentious. The defense often attempts to question the victim's reliability or competence." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. "They'll suggest I imagined or misinterpreted what happened." "Exactly," Lisa confirmed. "Which is why the video evidence and medical documentation are so crucial in your case. They provide objective verification that doesn't rely solely on testimony." After Lisa departed, promising to see them at the afternoon meeting, Eleanor sat quietly, contemplating the path ahead. The criminal justice system was unfamiliar territory for her, a realm she had only encountered through news reports and crime novels. "Are you all right, Mom?" Michael asked, noticing her thoughtful silence. "I'm considering what your father would think of all this," she replied honestly. "Robert was always so private about family matters. The idea of our personal struggles becoming part of court records and legal proceedings would have troubled him." Michael sat beside her on the sofa. "Dad also believed in justice and accountability. He wouldn't have wanted Diane to escape consequences for actions that could have harmed you." Eleanor smiled softly. "You're right. He had that strong moral compass, something I see in you as well, despite recent complications." The afternoon at the district attorney's office proved less intimidating than Eleanor had anticipated. The assistant district attorney, Jeremy Matthews, was professionally compassionate, guiding her through her statement with careful attention to detail while ensuring she felt comfortable with the process. "Mrs. James, your documentation has been extraordinarily helpful," Matthews commented as they concluded. "Many elder exploitation cases struggle with evidence collection, but you've provided us with video, medical records, and contemporaneous notes that create a compelling narrative." "I taught my students to substantiate their arguments with evidence," Eleanor replied. "It seemed only reasonable to apply the same standard to my own situation." Matthews smiled. "Your teaching background shows. Now, I should prepare you. Diane has retained Kenneth Abernathy as her defense attorney. He's known for aggressive tactics, particularly in questioning the reliability of elderly witnesses." "I'm familiar with Mr. Abernathy's reputation," Eleanor said calmly. "He defended the Westmore nursing home in that neglect case 2 years ago." The attorney looked surprised. "You followed that case?" "I volunteer with literacy programs at the senior center. Elder abuse and exploitation are unfortunately common topics of conversation." Eleanor straightened her shoulders slightly. "Mr. Abernathy doesn't intimidate me. I spent 35 years managing teenagers who thought they could outsmart me. I imagine the principles are somewhat similar." Sophie, who had been quietly supportive throughout the meeting, couldn't suppress a smile at her grandmother's composure. Grammy taught Savannah's most challenging students for decades. Courtroom. Cross-examination might actually be easier. As they left the government building, Eleanor was surprised to find several of her former colleagues from Savannah Central High School waiting in the lobby. Margaret Chen, her longtime friend and former English department chair, stepped forward to embrace her. "We heard what happened," Margaret said. "The teacher grapevine still works, even in retirement." Eleanor was deeply moved by this unexpected show of support. "How did you know I'd be here today?" "Sophie called us," explained Harold Washington, who had taught history across the hall from Eleanor for 20 years. "She thought you might appreciate some friendly faces." Looking at the small gathering of educators who had shaped generations of Savannah's youth alongside her, Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude. These were people who understood standing firm in difficult circumstances, who had faced their own battles in classrooms and school board meetings, advocating for students and educational principles year after year. "We're taking you to dinner," announced Beatrice Johnson, the former mathematics teacher whose precise handwriting and equally precise moral standards had intimidated and inspired students in equal measure. "No arguments. We've reserved the private room at Elizabeth's." The evening that followed became a healing balm for Eleanor's spirit. Surrounded by colleagues who had become friends over decades of shared purpose, she found herself laughing for the first time in weeks. They shared stories of difficult parents, administrative challenges, and students who had tested their patience and ultimately rewarded their persistence, experiences that suddenly seemed relevant to her current struggle in unexpected ways. "Remember when the school board tried to ban Steinbeck?" Harold reminisced over dessert. Eleanor here marched into that meeting with 15 years of teaching notes and student impact statements. "They didn't stand a chance." "The principle is always the same," Margaret observed, sipping her coffee. "Stand your ground when you know you're right, document everything, and never let anyone use your age or position against you." As Eleanor prepared to leave, Beatrice pressed something into her hand, a small silver pin in the shape of an owl. "The symbol of Athena," she explained. "Wisdom and strategic warfare. Seemed appropriate for what you're facing." The support of her former colleagues carried Eleanor through the difficult weeks that followed. The legal process moved forward with deliberate slowness, each step bringing new challenges. From her own painful experience had emerged a ripple effect of protection and empowerment that continued to expand in ways she could never have anticipated. The medication Diane had hidden had been meant to diminish Eleanor's independence. Instead, that very act had triggered a response that was enhancing the independence of countless others. Eleanor turned toward her home, where lights glowed warmly in windows that had witnessed 43 years of her family's history. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, presentations to prepare, correspondence to answer, strategies to develop. The work was demanding, but it carried the profound satisfaction that comes from transforming personal pain into collective healing. As she entered her home and closed the door behind her, Eleanor James smiled at the irony that had defined this unexpected chapter of her life. By trying to steal her independence, Diane had inadvertently helped her discover her most significant purpose. By hiding her medication, she had prompted Eleanor to hide the deed, a single defensive action that had evolved into a movement protecting thousands. Sometimes, Eleanor murmured to herself as she prepared for bed, "The greatest threats reveal our greatest strengths, if we have the courage to respond with wisdom rather than fear." In her bedroom, Eleanor paused before the photograph of Robert that had kept watch over her sleep for the 5 years since his passing. "You always said I was a force to be reckoned with," she told his smiling image. "I don't think either of us realized just how true that would prove to be." Outside, the spring breeze moved gently through the garden Robert had planted and Eleanor had tended through decades of life's changes. The same breeze now carried the ripple effect of her courage throughout their community and beyond, a living testament to the truth that no one is too old to create meaningful change, and that even our most difficult experiences can become the foundation for our most important contributions. Eleanor James, who had hidden her deed to protect her home, had discovered that her most valuable possession had never been the house itself, but the wisdom, courage, and compassion that no one could ever take from her, qualities that had become her true legacy in this unexpected final chapter of her remarkable life. The grand ballroom of the Washington Hilton hummed with anticipation as attendees of the National Conference on Aging filed in, program booklets in hand, many pausing to study the large portrait photograph of Eleanor James that graced the entrance. The image captured her with perfect authenticity, silver hair swept into an elegant twist, clear eyes reflecting both wisdom and determination, shoulders squared with the same dignified posture that had commanded respect in classrooms for decades. "2 minutes, Mrs. James," the conference coordinator whispered, adjusting the small microphone clipped to Eleanor's navy blue blazer. We have a full house, over 1,000 attendees, including representatives from every state's aging services department. Eleanor nodded calmly, though her pulse quickened slightly at the scope of this opportunity. 1 year had passed since she had discovered Diane tampering with her heart medication, 1 year of transformation that had carried her from vulnerability to this national platform. "You're going to be magnificent," Sophie whispered from beside her, squeezing her grandmother's hand supportively. "Just like you were with generations of students." The conference director approached the podium, welcoming the assembled experts, advocates, and policymakers before introducing Eleanor with a summary of the remarkable impact her protection protocol had already demonstrated in Georgia and several neighboring states. "The data speaks for itself," the director concluded. "In communities where the Eleanor James protocol has been implemented, reported cases of elder exploitation have increased by 40%, not because exploitation is increasing, but because victims now have the tools to recognize and report it. Meanwhile, financial losses have decreased by 35% due to early intervention." Ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to introduce the woman whose personal courage has launched a movement, Mrs. Eleanor James. The applause that greeted Eleanor as she took the podium carried a quality of genuine respect rather than mere politeness. These were professionals who recognized the practical value of what she had created, who understood the challenges of protecting vulnerable populations while honoring their autonomy. "Good morning," Eleanor began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the large space. 1 year ago, I stood in my kitchen staring at empty compartments in my pill organizer where my heart medication should have been. In that moment, I faced a critical choice: to doubt my own memory and perceptions, or to trust my instincts that something was wrong." She paused, making eye contact with different sections of the audience. "That simple decision, to trust myself rather than accept others' characterizations of my capabilities, became the foundation of everything we're discussing today. Because elder exploitation begins not with stolen assets, but with stolen confidence. When we can be convinced to doubt our own judgment, we become vulnerable to those who would control our resources and diminish our independence." For the next 40 minutes, Eleanor detailed the components of the protection protocol, illustrating each point with examples from cases that had been addressed through the initiative. She explained how medical professionals could document cognitive capabilities rather than just limitations, how financial institutions could implement verification systems that protected assets without restricting access, and how law enforcement could investigate exploitation claims without infantilizing the elderly victims. "The core principle," she emphasized, "is partnership rather than paternalism. Protection that enhances autonomy rather than diminishing it. Systems that recognize the wisdom and agency of older adults while acknowledging the specific vulnerabilities that may emerge with age." As Eleanor concluded her formal presentation and opened the floor for questions, the engagement of the audience confirmed that her message had resonated deeply. Hands shot up throughout the ballroom, representing various dimensions of elder care and protection. A director of adult protective services from Minnesota was called on first. "Mrs. James, your protocol emphasizes documentation and evidence collection by the elderly person themselves. How do we adapt this approach for those with more significant cognitive impairments who may not be able to implement these strategies independently?" "An excellent question," Eleanor acknowledged. "The protocol includes a circle of protection component specifically designed for those situations. It involves creating a network of multiple individuals with different relationships to the elder, family members, healthcare providers, community contacts, who collectively monitor for signs of exploitation. No single person has complete control, creating a system of mutual accountability." The questions continued, probing the practical applications, legal implications, and implementation challenges of the protocol. Throughout, Eleanor responded with the same thoughtful clarity that had characterized her teaching, drawing on both her personal experience and the collective wisdom developed through the coalition's work over the past year. As the session concluded to enthusiastic applause, Eleanor found herself surrounded by conference attendees eager to discuss specific applications in their communities. Among them was a distinguished woman in her 70s who introduced herself as Dr. Camille Washington, the newly appointed Federal Commissioner on Aging. "Mrs. James, your work has come to our attention at precisely the right moment," Dr. Washington said, guiding Eleanor toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. "The administration is preparing a major initiative on elder protection, and we believe your approach offers the balanced framework we've been seeking." Eleanor listened with growing amazement as the commissioner outlined the possibility of implementing key elements of the protection protocol at the federal level, through Medicare guidelines, banking regulations, and law enforcement training. Programs that could reach every community in the nation. We would like you to serve as a special advisor to the Commission, Dr. Washington concluded. Your lived experience combined with the evidence-based approach you've developed represents exactly the perspective we need. The conversation was interrupted by Sophie, who approached with barely contained excitement. Grammy, the media response is incredible. You're trending on social media, and 3 national news programs have requested interviews. Eleanor absorbed these developments with a characteristic blend of composure and strategic thinking. The platform she had been given carried both opportunity and responsibility, a chance to expand the reach of protections she had developed, while ensuring the core principles weren't lost in the process. Dr. Washington, I'm honored by your invitation, she said carefully. Before I accept, I would need assurance that the protocol's emphasis on autonomy and dignity would remain central. This can't become another system that protects assets while diminishing personhood. The commissioner nodded with evident respect. Margaret recommended the same thing. I have an appointment with Barbara Washington tomorrow afternoon. She specializes in elder protection cases. You've been busy this morning, Sophie observed with a hint of pride. I taught American literature. For 35 years, Eleanor replied with a small smile. I know how the story of manipulation and control typically unfolds. I'm simply writing a different ending. After lunch, they reviewed their security measures. The camera in the kitchen remained active, now joined by a second one disguised as a bookend in the living room. Eleanor's medication was secured in a small combination safe in her bedroom closet, with a decoy pill organizer left visible on the kitchen counter. Her important documents were now in the bank's safe deposit box, and Sophie had set up alerts that would notify both of them if anyone attempted to access Eleanor's medical records through the patient portal. It feels like we're preparing for war, Eleanor sighed as they finished their planning. Not war, Grammy. Self-defense. Sophie's expression was fierce with protective love. They're the ones who started this. That evening, Eleanor sat at her antique secretary desk and began writing in a leather-bound journal, documenting each instance of missing medication, each concerning conversation, each subtle undermining comment from Diane. She recorded dates, times, and detailed descriptions with the precision of someone who had spent decades grading essays and evaluating nuanced student behavior. The phone rang, interrupting her documentation. Mom, it's Michael. I tried to stop by earlier, but my key didn't work. Eleanor took a deep breath, steadying herself. Yes, I had the locks changed today. The locksmith noticed signs that someone might have been trying to tamper with them. The lie came more easily than she expected, necessary protection while she gathered evidence. What? That's concerning, Michael's voice carried genuine worry. Do you think someone's been trying to break in? Should we call the police? The locksmith didn't think it warranted that, Eleanor replied smoothly. But he recommended upgrading the locks as a precaution. I have a new key for you, but I've been busy today. Perhaps you could stop by tomorrow evening to pick it up? Actually, Diane and I wanted to talk to you about something important. We could come by around 6? Eleanor felt a cold certainty that this important conversation would involve more pressure about selling the house or moving to assisted living. 6 would be fine. I'll make some dinner for us. After hanging up, she called Sophie immediately. They're coming tomorrow at 6. I think they're planning to escalate the pressure. I'll be there, Sophie replied without hesitation. And I'll bring the portable recorder Ben lent me. Georgia is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. We only need your permission, not theirs. The next day moved with dizzying speed. Dr. Patel conducted a thorough examination, documenting Eleanor's excellent cognitive function and her ability to manage her own healthcare. Your heart is doing remarkably well, Eleanor, the cardiologist said as she reviewed the test results. But I'm concerned about these instances of missing medication. Even short interruptions in your regimen could cause serious problems. I've taken steps to secure my medication, Eleanor assured her. But I'd appreciate if you'd note in my records that I've reported this issue to you. Dr. Patel looked up sharply. Do you have concerns about someone interfering with your medication? Deliberately? Eleanor met her gaze steadily. I have video evidence of it. The doctor's expression hardened. I'll document everything in detail, and I'm noting that you're fully competent to manage your medical decisions. If anyone questions your capacity, they'll need to go through me first. From the medical office, Eleanor went directly to meet with Barbara Washington, the elder law attorney Margaret had recommended. Barbara was a formidable woman in her 50s, with keen eyes that seemed to absorb every detail as Eleanor presented the evidence they had gathered. Mrs. James, what you're describing is a textbook case of elder exploitation, Barbara said after reviewing the documentation and watching the video footage. The medication tampering is particularly serious, it could be charged as assault or even attempted murder, depending on intent. What are my options? Eleanor asked, her teacher's pragmatism emerging. Several, Barbara replied, leaning forward. We can seek an emergency protective order, file police reports, or pursue civil remedies. But first, we need to establish your legal protections. By the time Barbara finished outlining the legal strategy, Eleanor had signed documents appointing Sophie as her healthcare proxy and durable power of attorney, legal safeguards that would prevent Michael or Diane from gaining control over her affairs even if she became temporarily incapacitated. The property deed transfer you already completed was an excellent first step, Barbara noted. By placing the house in a life estate with Sophie as the remainder beneficiary, you've protected your most valuable asset. Will these measures be enough? Eleanor asked. Barbara's expression was determined. They create significant legal barriers, but the medication tampering is criminal behavior. Are you prepared to confront that directly? Eleanor thought of her classroom management philosophy: clear boundaries, consistent consequences, and always addressing problems directly, rather than allowing them to fester. Yes. But I want to give my son one chance to separate himself from what his wife is doing. That's your decision, Barbara said. But go into that conversation with protection in place. Never confront potential abusers alone. By late afternoon, Eleanor had returned home to prepare for the evening's confrontation. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing a simple meal of Robert's favorite pot roast with root vegetables, comfort food that seemed appropriate for what would be anything but a comfortable conversation. Sophie arrived at 5:30, helping to set the dining room table with Eleanor's good china, the set that had been a wedding gift from Robert's parents 43 years ago. Are you nervous? Sophie asked, arranging silverware with precision. Not nervous, Eleanor replied thoughtfully. Sad. Whatever happens tonight will permanently change my relationship with your father. Even if he's innocent of direct involvement, our family will never be the same. Sophie squeezed her grandmother's hand. Sometimes relationships have to change to become honest. You taught me that. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Eleanor smoothed her cardigan, squared her shoulders, and went to greet her son and his wife with the dignified composure that had carried her through 4 decades of teaching. Michael, Diane, she said, opening the door. Please come in. Diane stepped forward first, offering a practiced hug and an envelope. We brought some materials we'd like to discuss with you, Eleanor. Information about Magnolia Gardens retirement community. Eleanor accepted the envelope with a neutral smile. How thoughtful. Dinner is ready, shall we eat first before discussing business? Throughout the meal, Eleanor observed the subtle dynamics between Michael and Diane. Her son's deference to his wife's opinions, the way his eyes sought her approval before speaking, the nervous glances when Eleanor asked direct questions about their sudden interest in retirement communities. Was he complicit in Diane's schemes, or another victim of her manipulation? This pot roast is delicious, Mom, Michael said, breaking a brief silence. Just like when I was growing up. Grandpa's favorite recipe, Sophie added pointedly. Family traditions are so important to preserve. Diane smiled tightly. Speaking of preservation, Eleanor, we brought those materials because we're concerned about your ability to maintain this large house. The stairs, the upkeep, it's a lot for someone your age to manage alone. I'm not alone, Eleanor replied calmly. I have Sophie nearby, Mrs. Patterson helps with heavy cleaning twice a month. And Mr. Jenkins handles the yard work. The house is in excellent condition. But your health, Diane pressed, her voice carrying practiced concern. Michael mentioned you've been having trouble with your medication. Forgetfulness can be dangerous at your age. Eleanor sat down. Her fork deliberately. That's actually something I wanted to discuss. I've been having trouble with my medication, specifically, pills going missing from my organizer. A flicker of alarm crossed Diane's perfectly composed face. Missing? How strange. Perhaps you're taking them and forgetting? That's what I thought initially, Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level as she reached for her iPad. Until I installed a security camera to help me understand what was happening. The color drained from Diane's face as Eleanor turned the screen toward them, showing a paused video image of Diane standing at the kitchen counter, clearly taking pills. From the organizer. What is this? Michael asked, confusion evident in his voice as he stared at the screen. This is footage from 3 days ago, Eleanor said quietly. Diane removing my heart medication while I was in the garden cutting herbs for our lunch. There must be some misunderstanding, Diane said quickly, her voice higher than normal. I was just checking to make sure you were taking them properly. Eleanor pressed play, allowing the video to run. The footage clearly showed Diane pocketing the pills while glancing nervously toward the garden door. You weren't checking, Sophie said, her voice tight with controlled anger. You were stealing life-saving medication. Michael's face had gone from confusion to horror as he watched the undeniable evidence. Diane? What is this? Why would you? Michael, your mother is clearly becoming paranoid, Diane interrupted, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. Setting up secret cameras, making accusations, these are signs of cognitive decline. This is exactly why we need to consider more supervised living arrangements. The cameras were my idea, Sophie stated firmly. After Grammy noticed her heart medication repeatedly disappearing. The same medication that Dr. Patel says could cause a life-threatening cardiac event if doses are missed. Michael looked between his wife and his mother, his expression stricken. Mom, is this true? Your medication has been disappearing? Yes, Eleanor replied simply. For weeks now. At first, I thought I was becoming forgetful, as Diane suggested. But when it continued happening in a pattern that aligned with your visits, I became concerned. This is ridiculous, Diane snapped, her composed facade cracking. You can't possibly believe I would deliberately take your medication. What purpose would that serve? I've been wondering that myself, Eleanor said, her voice remaining calm despite the tension filling the room. Until I remembered our conversation 2 months ago about adding Sophie to the deed of this house. You seemed quite upset by that news. Michael turned to Diane, confusion evident in his expression. What does the house have to do with Mom's medication? Eleanor looked directly at her son. If I were to suffer another heart attack due to inconsistent medication, who would make decisions about my care? About my property? I would, as your next of kin, Michael answered slowly, the pieces visibly connecting in his mind. And given how closely you consult with Diane on all major decisions, effectively she would control what happens to me and to this house, Eleanor continued. A house that's now worth well over $1 million in Savannah's current real estate market. The silence that followed was deafening. Diane's expression had transformed from practiced concern to cold calculation as she realized the extent of Eleanor's understanding. You can't prove any of this, Diane finally said, her voice hard. A video of me touching a pill container doesn't prove intent. Perhaps not conclusively, Eleanor agreed. But today I met with both my cardiologist and an elder law attorney. Dr. Patel has documented the missing medication and my concerns in my medical record. And Barbara Washington is prepared to seek a protective order if necessary. Michael stood abruptly, his face ashen. Mom, I swear I didn't know about any of this. I was genuinely concerned about you living alone, but I never would have. He stopped, turning to Diane. Did you really take her medication? Answer me. Diane's eyes darted between the 3 family members facing her. Whatever she saw in their expressions seemed to trigger a calculation behind her eyes. She straightened her shoulders, her demeanor shifting from defensive to coldly pragmatic. Michael, you need to consider what's happening here. Your mother and daughter have clearly conspired to create this story because they don't approve of me. They've never accepted me into this family. The video shows you taking my medication, Eleanor said quietly. It shows me organizing your pills, Diane countered. Because you're becoming increasingly forgetful and confused. The fact that you've jumped to these paranoid conclusions only confirms my concerns about your mental state. Eleanor felt a deep sadness watching this performance. How thoroughly had Diane manipulated Michael over these past months? Would he choose to believe his wife's denials despite the clear evidence before him? There's something else you should know, Eleanor said, turning to her son. I've transferred the deed to this house into a life estate, with Sophie as the remainder beneficiary. Even if something happens to me, this house will never be sold without Sophie's consent. Diane's composure shattered completely. You did. What? You can't do that. Michael, she can't just give away your inheritance. The naked greed in Diane's voice seemed to finally penetrate Michael's confusion. He stared at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. This was never about Mom's well-being, was it? He asked slowly. This was about getting control of her assets. Don't be ridiculous, Diane snapped, though her voice lacked conviction. I've only ever wanted what's best for this family. By stealing my mother's heart medication? Michael's voice rose in disbelief. By trying to make her sick enough to lose her independence? How is that what's best for anyone except you? Eleanor watched the confrontation with a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Her son hadn't been complicit, just blind to the manipulation happening right before him. It was small comfort given the pain he was now experiencing, but it meant their relationship might eventually heal. I think you should leave now, Diane, Eleanor said firmly. Michael is welcome to stay if he wishes, but I want you out of my house. Diane looked between them, clearly calculating her options and finding them limited. Michael, are you coming? The question hung in the air, a test of loyalty that would define everything that followed. Michael looked at his mother and daughter, then back to his wife of less than a year. No, he said finally. I'm staying to talk with my family. We have a lot to figure out. Diane's face contorted with fury. You'll regret this. All of you. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, pausing only to deliver a final barb. Don't think this is over, Eleanor. You may have won this round, but you're still an old woman living alone. Accidents happen all the time. The threat lingered in the air after the door slammed behind her. Sophie immediately moved to lock it, then turned to her father with undisguised anger. How could you not see what she was doing? Grammy could have died if we hadn't figured this out. Michael sank back into his chair, his face a mask of shock and grief. I thought she genuinely cared about Mom. About our family. I never imagined she could do something like this. Eleanor reached across the table to take her son's hand. Love makes us vulnerable to deception, Michael. You wanted to believe the best about her. That's no excuse, he said bitterly. I should have protected you, not exposed you to danger. What matters now is what we do next, Eleanor said, her teacher's pragmatism emerging. Diane's threat just now suggests she won't stop easily. Sophie nodded grimly. We need to contact Barbara Washington tonight. That threat constitutes grounds for an immediate protective order. As Sophie made the call, Michael looked at his mother with tearful eyes. Can you ever forgive me for bringing her into our lives? Eleanor considered the question seriously. Forgiveness isn't a single moment, Michael. It's a process we'll work through together. But yes, I believe we can rebuild what's been damaged. We're still family. Outside, a spring storm was gathering, lightning occasionally illuminating the darkening garden where generations of the James family had celebrated birthdays, holidays, and ordinary Tuesday evenings. Eleanor watched the approaching weather with the calm of someone who had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical, and knew that even the most turbulent eventually passed. This storm within her family would take time to resolve. There would be police reports, possible criminal charges, certainly a divorce, and a long process of rebuilding trust. But as she sat with her son and granddaughter, planning their next steps, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude for the wisdom that had helped her recognize the danger and the courage that had allowed her to confront it. You know, she said thoughtfully as they waited for Barbara Washington to return Sophie's call, your grandfather always said that the true measure of a person isn't how they handle success, but how they respond to betrayal and disappointment. Do they become bitter, or do they become wiser and more compassionate? Michael looked up, his expression still haunted by the evening's revelations. Which did you choose after Dad died? Eleanor smiled gently. I chose to become a student of my own grief, to learn from it rather than be consumed by it. That's the choice we have now too. We can learn from this betrayal, use it to become more discerning without becoming cynical. As the storm finally broke over Savannah, releasing rain that would nourish the azaleas and magnolias throughout the historic district, Eleanor James sat surrounded by the family that truly loved her, secure in the knowledge that she had trusted her instincts, protected her independence, and perhaps most importantly, shown her granddaughter what courage looked like in the face of manipulation and deceit. The hidden deed had saved her home, but it was her willingness to stand firm against exploitation that had truly preserved her dignity and her future. The morning light filtered through Eleanor's bedroom curtains, casting gentle patterns across the antique quilt her grandmother had made decades ago. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Diane, 3 weeks of legal meetings, police reports, and difficult conversations. Eleanor sat at her vanity, brushing her silver hair. With deliberate strokes, a morning ritual that had remained constant through all of life's upheavals. That commitment to balancing protection with autonomy is precisely why we want your involvement. Too often, these initiatives swing too far in either direction, either inadequate protection or excessive restriction. Your approach achieves the balance we've been seeking. Later that evening, as Eleanor and Sophie shared dinner in the hotel restaurant, they reflected on the extraordinary developments of the day. What had begun as one woman's self-defense strategy in a Savannah kitchen had evolved into a movement with potential national impact. I keep thinking about your students, Sophie remarked, sipping her wine thoughtfully. All those years you spent teaching them to analyze literature, never imagining you'd be writing a new chapter of social policy in your retirement. Eleanor smiled, considering the unexpected trajectory of her life. Teaching literature was always about more than the books themselves. It was about recognizing patterns, understanding motivations, and ultimately, finding your voice in response to challenges. Those same skills proved essential when confronting Diane's manipulation. And now you're teaching those skills to an entire generation of seniors, Sophie observed. Creating a legacy that extends far beyond your classroom. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Michael, who had flown in for the conference's second day after finalizing arrangements for the Protection Protocol Training Center being established in Savannah. "Mom, you were extraordinary today," he said, embracing Eleanor warmly before joining them at the table. The Georgia delegation was practically bursting with pride that this initiative began in our state. As their dinner progressed, the conversation turned to the practical considerations of Eleanor's expanding role. The commissioner's invitation would require regular travel to Washington, media appearances would demand careful preparation, and the Savannah Coalition still needed guidance as it implemented community education programs. "I'm concerned about overextending yourself," Michael admitted, his protective instincts evident. "This is becoming a full-time commitment at a time when most people are reducing their responsibilities." Eleanor considered her son's concern with genuine appreciation for its loving intent. "Michael, what would you have said to a promising student who was considering declining a challenging opportunity because it might be too demanding?" He smiled ruefully, recognizing his mother's teaching technique. "I would have encouraged them to assess whether the challenge aligned with their values and capabilities, not their age or conventional expectations." "Precisely," Eleanor replied. "This work aligns perfectly with my values and utilizes capabilities I've developed throughout my life. The fact that this opportunity arrived in my 69th year rather than my 39th is irrelevant to whether I should accept it." Sophie laughed softly. "Grammy just schooled you, Dad." The next morning, Eleanor met with Commissioner Washington to accept the advisory position, with specific parameters that would allow her to maintain her community work in Savannah while contributing to national policy development. The role would begin with a comprehensive review of existing elder protection programs across federal agencies, identifying gaps and inconsistencies that the protocol could address. Following this meeting, Eleanor participated in a panel discussion with leading experts in geriatric medicine, elder law, and financial security. What struck many observers was the natural authority she brought to conversations with professionals who held advanced degrees in their specialties, the lived experience that complemented their theoretical knowledge in crucial ways. Dr. Leonard Abramson, a renowned geriatrician from Johns Hopkins, commented on this dynamic during their discussion. "What makes the James protocol so effective is that it emerges from the intersection of personal experience and systematic analysis." Mrs. James didn't just react emotionally to her exploitation attempt, she developed a structured response that addresses the underlying vulnerabilities without compromising dignity. As the conference continued, Eleanor found herself increasingly sought after by attendees who recognized the practical value of her approach. Between scheduled sessions, she met with representatives from senior advocacy organizations, financial institutions developing new security protocols, and law enforcement agencies seeking better tools for investigating exploitation cases. On the final evening of the conference, a special recognition dinner honored pioneers in elder advocacy from across the country. Eleanor, seated at the head table with Commissioner Washington and other dignitaries, felt a moment of reflection. As she observed the hundreds of dedicated professionals who had committed their careers to protecting and empowering the elderly. When she was called forward to receive the Distinguished Advocacy Award, the standing ovation that greeted her carried a quality of genuine appreciation for the practical impact of her work. The citation, read by the conference chair, noted that Eleanor James has transformed a personal violation into a systematic approach to protection that honors the wisdom, agency, and dignity of older adults while creating effective safeguards against exploitation. As Eleanor accepted the Crystal Award, she took a moment to acknowledge the collaborative nature of the achievement. "This recognition belongs not just to me, but to the coalition of professionals, advocates, and seniors who helped develop these protections. Particularly to my son Michael and granddaughter Sophie, who provided the initial support that made everything else possible." She paused, gathering her thoughts for what she felt was the most important part of her message. "When my daughter-in-law began removing my heart medication, her goal was to make me appear incapable of managing my own affairs. The cruel irony is that her attempt to diminish me has instead expanded my capacity to serve others in ways I never imagined." Looking out at the attentive faces before her, Eleanor continued with growing conviction. "There's a powerful lesson in that transformation, one that applies not just to elder protection, but to how we approach aging itself in our society. Too often, we focus on what is diminishing rather than what is emerging. We define aging by what is lost rather than what is gained through decades of experience and wisdom." The room had grown completely silent, hundreds of professionals leaning forward slightly to catch every word. "The most effective protection against exploitation isn't just better locks on our doors or monitoring of our finances, though those are certainly important. It's the recognition of our continued value, purpose, and capacity for contribution throughout our entire lifespan." As Eleanor concluded her remarks, the applause that filled the ballroom reflected more than professional courtesy, it carried the energy of a movement gaining momentum, of ideas whose time had come. Several attendees were visibly moved, recognizing in her words a vision of aging that honored the full humanity of older adults rather than reducing them to problems requiring management. Later that night, as Eleanor prepared for bed in her hotel room, her phone chimed with a message from Barbara Washington. The attorney had been monitoring a situation in Florida where a senior had used elements of the protection protocol to document and stop an exploitation attempt by a caregiver. Another success story, the message read. Mrs. Levinson sends her regards. She's implementing the protocol in her retirement community and reports 5 cases already identified and addressed. Eleanor smiled at this update about Elizabeth Levinson, whose near victimization by Diane and Patricia had been prevented through timely intervention. The ripple effect continued to expand, each person protected becoming a potential protector for others. A knock at her door revealed Sophie, still energized by the evening's events and bearing 2 cups of chamomile tea. I thought you might like to decompress before sleep, she explained, settling into the armchair by the window while Eleanor took the edge of the bed. Have you had a chance to process what's happening? Sophie asked after they had sipped their tea in comfortable silence for a few moments. This has all evolved so quickly. Eleanor considered the question thoughtfully. I've been thinking about something my mother used to say, that the most important preparations in life aren't the ones we plan, but the ones life plans for us through challenges we never anticipated. How so? Sophie prompted. When I was teaching, I prepared students to analyze literature, construct arguments, and express themselves clearly. I never imagined those same skills would be crucial for protecting myself and others from exploitation. Decades later. Eleanor paused, gathering her thoughts. Similarly, the skills you're developing as an artist, observation, pattern recognition, translation of complex ideas into accessible forms, have proven essential for our advocacy work. Sophie nodded, understanding the deeper point her grandmother was making. So the measure of our preparation isn't how it serves our expected future, but how it equips us for the unexpected challenges and opportunities that actually arrive. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. And that perspective transforms how we approach aging itself. Instead of seeing later years as a diminishment of capability, we can recognize them as a time when our accumulated wisdom and skills may find their most significant applications, often in ways we never could have predicted. The following morning, as Eleanor prepared to return to Savannah, she received a call from Jeremy Matthews at the Georgia District Attorney's office. His news was unexpected and momentarily unsettling. Mrs. James, I wanted you to hear this from me before it potentially becomes public. Diane has been released from her probation program early based on exemplary compliance and completion of all required counseling. Eleanor absorbed this information with characteristic thoughtfulness. Is there reason for concern? Should we be worried about her attempting contact despite the restraining order? Her counselor and probation officer both believe the rehabilitation is genuine, Matthews replied. She's relocated to Arizona and has provided documentation of employment there. But I wanted you to be aware, given your high-profile advocacy work. After ending the call, Eleanor stood at her hotel window, looking out over the Washington skyline with its iconic monuments and institutions. The news about Diane stirred complex emotions, not fear, but a contemplative recognition of how completely their lives had diverged since that confrontation in Eleanor's kitchen a year ago. While Diane had served her sentence and begun rebuilding her life in obscurity, Eleanor had discovered an entirely new chapter of purpose that was creating positive impact throughout the country. The attempt to diminish her had instead revealed capacities even she hadn't fully recognized in herself. As she finished packing for the flight home, Eleanor noticed a handwritten note that had been slipped under her door. The elegant stationery bore the seal of the Commission on Aging, but the message was personal rather than official. Dear Eleanor, your courage in transforming personal violation into public service represents the highest form of leadership. You have reminded us all that our most painful experiences can become our most valuable contributions when approached with wisdom and generosity. With admiration and gratitude, Camille Washington. Eleanor tucked the note carefully into her journal. Touched by this recognition from someone whose own contributions to elder advocacy spanned decades. The validation from respected peers meant more to her than the formal awards or media attention. It confirmed that the work itself had substantive value beyond her personal story. On the flight back to Savannah, Eleanor reviewed her notes from the conference, identifying key partnerships to develop and policy recommendations to prioritize in her new advisory role. Beside her, Sophie sketched preliminary designs for the educational murals that would bring the protection protocol to visual life in senior centers throughout Georgia. I've been thinking about the central image, Sophie explained, showing Eleanor a concept drawing that depicted hands of different ages linked in a protective circle. It represents the intergenerational partnership that makes the protocol effective, neither paternalistic control nor isolated vulnerability, but connected support. Eleanor studied the design with appreciation for its elegant translation of complex concepts into visual form. It captures exactly what we're trying to create, protection that empowers rather than diminishes. As their plane descended toward Savannah, Eleanor gazed out at the coastal landscape that had been home for most of her life. The historic city had witnessed her journey from young bride to widow, from classroom teacher to national advocate, from potential victim to architect of protection for others. Michael was waiting at the airport, his face lighting up at the sight of his mother and daughter emerging from the arrival gate. "Welcome home, policymakers," he called, embracing them both. "The local news covered your speech, they're calling you Savannah's elder advocate and suggesting the mayor should proclaim an Eleanor James Day." Eleanor laughed at this notion, though she was touched by the community's pride in the initiative that had begun in her kitchen. "I'd settle for proper implementation of the protocol in every senior facility in the county. Recognition is flattering, but impact is what matters." As they drove through the familiar streets of Savannah, with its historic squares and moss-draped oak trees, Eleanor felt the comfortable sense of homecoming balanced with the expanding horizon of her work. This city had provided the stable foundation from which she could now reach outward, connecting local wisdom with national systems to create protection that honored the full humanity of aging adults. When they arrived at Eleanor's Victorian home on Whitaker Street, she was surprised to find several cars parked outside and lights glowing welcomingly through the windows. Michael smiled at her questioning look. "The coalition wanted to welcome you home properly. They've been monitoring the conference coverage and are pretty excited about next steps." Inside, Eleanor found her dining room filled with the friends and colleagues who had helped transform her personal defense strategy into a community movement. Margaret Chen, Beatrice Johnson, and Harold Washington were there from her teaching days, along with Barbara Washington, Dr. Patel, and a dozen coalition members who had joined more recently. A banner stretched across the wall proclaimed, "From personal courage to national impact," above a display of news articles, policy briefs, and implementation guides that documented the protocol's growing influence. As Eleanor moved through the gathering, accepting congratulations and updates on local initiatives, she was struck by how this historic home, the very property Diane had attempted to gain control of, had become the nerve center of a movement that was protecting countless other homes and their owners throughout the country. Later that evening, after the celebration had concluded and the house was quiet once more, Eleanor sat in her garden watching the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. The azaleas Robert had planted were in their full spring glory, their vibrant blooms a testament to care invested long before results could be seen. Much like the advocacy work that now defined her life, seeds planted through difficulty that were blossoming into protections for others she would never meet. The hidden medication that had been meant to diminish her had instead revealed her most significant purpose. The threatened deed that she had protected had become the foundation for a legacy far more valuable than property. As darkness settled fully over Savannah, Eleanor James remained in her garden, contemplating the unexpected journey that had carried her from vulnerability to influence, from potential victim to empowered advocate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, policy recommendations to develop, training programs to refine, partnerships to strengthen. But tonight, she savored the profound satisfaction of knowing that her response to betrayal had created ripples of protection that would continue expanding long after she was gone, a legacy not of bitterness or fear, but of wisdom, courage, and compassionate empowerment that honored the full humanity of aging adults throughout their lives. "The greatest protection," she whispered to the stars that had witnessed generations of human struggle and triumph, "is the recognition of our enduring value, regardless of age or circumstance." And in that quiet moment of reflection, Eleanor James embodied the truth she had discovered through her journey, that our most painful experiences can become our most valuable contributions when we face them with courage, transform them with wisdom, and share them with compassion to illuminate the path for others who follow. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.